This morning, the big week for Republicans. What is President Trump's case for a second term? We'll ask Donald Trump Jr. He is one of our guests. A rising star among Texas Democrats is also with us. Congresswoman Veronica Escobar from El Paso on how her party maintains the momentum after their virtual convention. State leaders say they'll punish cities that defund police. Republicans now running with that issue, but will it appeal to suburban voters? And a big problem coming in commercial real estate that could permanently erase jobs. We'll talk to Texas Congressman Van Taylor about his bipartisan solution.
Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley starts now.
And good Sunday morning to you. We are halfway through the national political conventions, and that is what we'll begin with in just a moment. But first, let's get you caught up on some Texas political headlines we are also watching. Republicans are on the defensive after one of their latest attack ads against MJ Hagar. The National Republican Senatorial Committee tweeted this doctored photo of the Democratic Senate nominee. The image is darkened, as you can see here, and makes her look older. Hagar fired back in a response on Twitter that, quote, politicians resort to tricks when they can't win on their own message. A spokesman for her opponent, John Cornyn, said it was wrong of the Senatorial Committee to alter that image. In Gainesville, north of Fort Worth, county commissioners there have decided to keep their Confederate monument. They voted 4-1 to do so last week. It's a 30-foot tall statue that was erected in 1911. Bud Kennedy from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram wrote on Facebook a little history for us. In October of 1862, Bud wrote, Cook County there actually hanged 42 people for disloyalty to the Confederacy. And last week this time, Texas Democrats expressed concern that they were not playing any bigger of a role in the national convention. Turns out the DNC recruited quite a few Texans to appear after all. George Floyd's family, as you just saw there, Congressman Beto O'Rourke, State Rep Victoria Niave, and Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo here, among others. If you watched the DNC, you also saw our first guest there on the national stage, a Texan and a Latina. And like a lot of people, she wondered whether a virtual convention would really work. But she says it turned out better than anyone expected, and that's mainly for one big reason. Congresswoman Veronica Escobar represents El Paso. It's the 16th congressional district in Texas, and that is from where she cast all of the state's Democratic delegates last week. That's also from where she spoke to us. Congresswoman, thanks for the time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Democrats are starting this next week with a lot of momentum after the DNC. The question is, how do you sustain that momentum through November when we have social distancing and all the separation?
Campaigns in the era of COVID are definitely far more challenging than ever before. You know, some of the best campaigns are run on the ground, in the field, face to face, at people's doorsteps. That's the way that I've run every single one of my own campaigns. That's what is behind winning campaigns. So in the absence of that, we have to use the tools available to us. And so, you know, that means, and I want to warn Texans, that means y'all are going to be getting a lot of phone calls. So you'll be getting texts, you'll be getting phone calls, you'll be getting mail. You know, there are fewer avenues for us to reach people, but we're going to use every avenue available.
And as you know, vice presidential candidates do not usually drive turnout, but does Kamala Harris's selection change anything for Joe Biden in the state?
I think this is a very different election year, and the selection of Senator Harris was monumental for women, monumental especially for women of color. You know, the last 4 years for many of us, and I'm speaking to you as a woman of color, not as a member of Congress, but as a woman of color, we have had to bear witness to the fact that children were separated from their parents at the border. We have seen unaccompanied minors expelled into countries that are not their own. We have seen really cruelty like we've never known in our generation. And so the people of color and minority communities have been on the receiving end. And so for many of us, the pure symbolism of having selected such an incredible talent who also happens to be a woman of color really resonates for many of us.
But how, you mentioned monumental. How is this different from 2016 when you had Hillary Clinton on the ticket as the nominee?
Well, I felt incredible excitement about the possibility and the hopes of having our first woman president. And I, along with many other Americans, thought that was what was going to happen, based on polling, based on, just what we were, our most aspirational hopes. This is different in a way because of the last 4 years, because of what we've seen, sort of an absence of humanity and an absence of concern for families. And so to have a woman again on the ticket is important. But again, the fact that she's a woman of color, historic. And I'm a big believer in the idea of when you see it, you can be it. And so what I think it says to so many little girls across the country whose their skin color is more like mine than like yours, it says, if you can see it, you can be it. There's just, there's so much to me to celebrate around this selection.
Congresswoman, on Tuesday night of last week, you represented Texas at the DNC roll call, which you cast the delegates for this state. Back in February, you delivered the Democratic response to the State of the Union. Your political influence, your star is rising in the party, if you don't mind me saying, I think. But what do you want people to know about you back east in other parts of Texas, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, places like that?
It's not about me. It's about a community that has been targeted by this administration, a community that has been maligned, a community that has suffered tremendous trauma. And what I want everyone in the country and in the state to know is that El Paso represents the best of America. We are compassionate, we are kind, we are generous, we are hopeful, and we are loving. And as I mentioned on Tuesday night, in the face of hate, we choose love. Always have, always will.
Congresswoman, thank you for the time.
Thank you so much.
Let's spend a moment now on something that's been overlooked since the pandemic began, the 2020 census. If you are not counted, your city will have less representation in government. But the Trump administration is ending the census a month early. California has sued to say the census would be botched by ending it early. But now Harris County is also joining that federal suit. That's according to the Texas Tribune. So let's sort all this out with Ross Ramsey, the legal aspect of this. He is the co-founder and executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Ross, good morning to you.
Good morning, Jason. How are you?
Doing well here. Harris County is now part of this federal lawsuit. What are the chances they might be able to keep things the way they are and have the count period go all the way through October?
They're worried that Texas is getting undercounted. Only about 60% of the people that are supposed to be counted in Texas have been counted. Our participation is a little bit low. The deadline was the end of October, and then the federal government moved it back. Texas leaders are afraid that's going to cut into Texas votes. And more importantly, for some of them, it's going to cut into Texas aid for everything from highways to Medicaid over the next 10 years after the census is done.
Yeah, a lot of federal money on the line. I want to ask you about a Texas Tribune story about Texas Democrats suing to get Green Party candidates off the ballot. Are Democrats afraid they're going to lose some vote count here or what?
Well, I think, the only time you really worry about third-party candidates is when you're in a really, really tight race. And, you can see historical examples of, Ralph Nader got this many votes, and that might have cost Al Gore the vote. Jill Stein got this many votes, might have cost Hillary Clinton. So they want to make sure that they're not competing with both a Republican and a Green Party. We've seen the Republican Party candidates in some races in the past try to knock off libertarians for the same reason. They're afraid the third party will eat some votes.
All right, Ross, interesting info there. Back to you in just a moment. Thank you. Coming up, a little talked about economic effect of the pandemic, commercial real estate. It could be heading to foreclosure, and that could permanently erase jobs. Texas Congressman Van Taylor is with us in a moment with his bipartisan fix. And what is the president's argument for 4 more years in the White House? That is one of our questions for Donald Trump Jr. He is with us as well when Inside Texas Politics returns. We are watching a huge political experiment right now. It's these virtual political conventions. 4 years from now, members of both parties might be able to meet again in person. But experts tell us that after these virtual events, national political conventions will never be the same again. This is the latest episode of our Yolitics Political Podcast, and here's how you can listen to it. Grab your phone or your tablet, aim its camera right there on the right-hand side of your screen at the QR code. It will take you directly to the latest episode. And remember, we drop new podcast episodes every Tuesday. You know, when we talk about the economic effects of the pandemic, we often discuss jobs. But commercial real estate is where so many of those jobs are. Businesses like retail, hotels, restaurants, malls, even industry. As long as the virus keeps those businesses from fully opening, owners of those spaces cannot pay their lease. And that's putting the commercial real estate market in a precarious position. Congressman Van Taylor, a Republican from Plano in Collin County, has a bipartisan legislation to address some of this, and the clock is ticking. Congressman, thanks for the time.
Great to be with you. Great to be with you.
A friend of mine in commercial real estate tells me that a tsunami of loans is coming to delinquency unless something happens, in Congress. What does your legislation do?
What's important here, Jason, is we've got to protect not just these jobs. We have to protect these jobs first and foremost, but we got to protect the properties, but also the communities that rely on them. So, here in Collin County, we are relying on having hospitality. We have to have hotels for business guests to come and stay when they visit corporate headquarters. I got a bunch of corporate headquarters up here. We got to have hospitality if we're going to have a successful county.
Let me add to that. For a lot of people, myself included, we may not fully understand why this is so vital for the commercial real estate market. What happens if this is not addressed?
Well, we're going to have a tsunami of foreclosures. We're at an all-time high in mortgage delinquencies for collateralized mortgage-backed securities, or CMBS commercial debt. That's about a third of the hotels in the United States have that CMBS debt, and the delinquency rate is actually a staggering over 60% of those hotel loans are delinquent in Houston, 20% are delinquent in the DFW area, but 54% are delinquent in Chicago.
Wow.
So you're seeing huge numbers of delinquencies across the country, and it's going to have devastating. It's not just the jobs that you're going to lose. You're also going to the communities, whether it's a convention center, a convention center in Houston, or whether it's a resort community, or whether it's a town like mine that relies on these. You got to have these hotels for business travelers to stay in to have a successful community.
I want to ask you about something else we've seen in the headlines lately, and that's defunding the police. Austin City Council unanimously did this, where they took a third of the budget away and they're going to put that money somewhere else. But the big get every election cycle, but especially this election cycle, are the women who live in the suburbs. You represent Collin County District 3, which is suburban of Dallas. How will this issue affect that vote? And is it resonating with them? Because right now, Austin's the biggest city doing this.
I'm really quite concerned for the future of the city of Austin. And I'm concerned for the future of our country if these radical left ideas of defunding the police manifest themselves in more cities defunding the police.
Congressman, just a few moments left here, too. Lots of polls predicting this could be a close presidential race in Texas. How close do you think it's going to be?
Well, I'm working every day to work for my constituents, to help them through this pandemic. We are worked hard on that, helping people with PPP loans, helping people get their economic impact checks, get their unemployment, and this election is really going to come down to two words: freedom and socialism. I'm for freedom. I'm for people getting to choose their own future and to keep what they make. And I'm not for an America where what you make is taken away from you, where there isn't private health insurance, where you defund the police, where the government is in control of your life. I'm against socialism. I'm for freedom, and I think that's what this election is about. And when I think the American people see that, I don't think we're gonna be in a good position.
All right, Congressman, thank you for the time.
Great to be with you, Jason.
Tomorrow night, the Republican National Convention kicks off. In fact, our program this morning was supposed to be coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. That is until COVID changed things. Like Democrats, the RNC will host a virtual convention to renominate Donald Trump. Our next guest this morning is the president's son, Donald Trump Jr. Mr. Trump, thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Let's talk about the case for a second term. What are the marquee items the president wants to tackle in his second term if he's reelected that he hasn't been able to accomplish so far?
Well, listen, I think we'd love to see him work with Democrats to be able to get an infrastructure bill. I think everyone recognizes that the infrastructure of this country has become dilapidated. Donald Trump is a builder. He understands how to do these things. He's tried to work with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats on this, which is why it's so important to take back the House, because they don't want to give Donald Trump yet another economic win. But especially now, coming out of the COVID crisis, putting Americans back to work, rebuilding our infrastructure is going to be so critical. And Donald Trump is legitimately the perfect guy for that because he's been a builder his entire life. He understands how to get that done.
Mr. Trump, I want to talk about polls because polls here in Texas show it could be a close race, the closest it's been in decades here. Will you or the president or the vice president be making any more campaign trips to Texas before the November election?
Well, I was actually supposed to be there tomorrow and Friday. Unfortunately, my uncle, my father's brother, passed away this past weekend. And so the funeral services are going to be this Friday. So we're going to do those events digitally now rather than in person.
I want to talk about the Republican National Convention is coming up here, too. What will your dad's main message be next Thursday night when he accepts the nomination again?
Well, listen, I think he's going to talk about rebuilding America, bringing it back from the China virus. The reality is before this, flu hit, America was in the greatest economic position it had ever been. The lowest unemployment numbers in history for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for women, for every demographic possible. The highest new startup business for the same group of people. The lowest income earners for the first time in modern history. Their wages were actually going up. That didn't happen by accident. That happened because Donald Trump had a plan.
Speaking of the November election, will you accept the results of what happens in November?
100%. If things are done fairly, right? I mean, to arbitrarily say that is a little ridiculous. You see what's going on with some of the mail-in balloting push. We're fine with absentee balloting, where we've said that 100%, where there's a system, but where randomly you blanket mail hundreds of millions of ballots to people who may not be living in those places is a system that's ripe with fraud. And you don't have to just believe me. Look at Jerry Nadler, not exactly a conservative. He said that about New York. New York right now is, I think, 50-something days post a primary. They still don't know who won because of that disaster. So utilizing existing things that have worked in the past is fine. But to try to rework that system for 350 million people 70 days out seems pretty ridiculous.
Mr. Trump, thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's great being with you.
Let's talk defunding police. Austin is restructuring its department, and Republicans want to make this an issue in November. But does it appeal to suburban voters? That is one of my questions for the Roundtable in just a moment.
This is Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley.
Time now for Reporters Roundtable to put the headlines in perspective. Ross is back. Bud Kennedy from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram is here each week. And of course, Bernadine Steptoe, the political producer at WFAA, is with us as well. Ross, we're starting with you and the Republican National Convention, which starts tomorrow. What do Texas Republicans, Texas conservatives want to hear from the president when he speaks later in the week?
They want to hear him reassert the case he made 4 years ago. He's running in some ways against the same administration. Biden was part of the Obama administration, and Trump, was a successful cure to that for the people that didn't like what was going on there. He'll try to reassert that and, explain what he's doing with the coronavirus, explain what he's doing with the economy, and ask people to stay the course.
And Bud, two questions for you. Number one, is that going to sell for 4 more years? And number two, I haven't seen many Texans. I haven't seen a final list of the rundown, but I haven't seen many Texans on stage next week.
It's odd we don't see a John Cornyn. We saw Rick Perry last convention. We don't see him. This is really weird to have a Republican convention without Texans speaking. But what the president needs to tell people is that he plans to keep America. And I've got to give Rodney Anderson from the Dallas County Republican Party told me this. He wants to hear the president say he wants to, that he will keep America strong, safe, and secure. Emphasize police, law enforcement, military strength. That's what Rodney wants.
And Bernadine, clearly that's going to sell among the president's base, the hardcore Republicans and conservatives. Is that going to sell in the general electorate, though, again, in November of this year?
I think it's going to be difficult because keep in mind, this election, he has a record. And that record doesn't bode well in terms of going outside of his base. And also, he must talk about how he's going to bring the COVID-19 under control. Because if you look at the polls, that is at the top of all voters, even in Texas. So since his record, he has to defend that record and talk about what he would do in the next term and not just talk to his base.
Yeah, it's a good point. 4 years ago, he didn't have a record to run on. Of course, he does now with after being in there for 4 years. We're also talking about the governor threatening to freeze property taxes for cities that defund police. On the surface, I'm all about freezing property taxes, but clearly this is seems like it's playing to his base. But is this going to fly? And we also don't know if Democrats might get majority control of the House. If that's the case, I can't imagine this going anywhere.
Well, the policy as he proposed it has a couple of holes in it. The state can't set property tax rates for one thing, or property taxes. And as you say, all you'd have to do to get your property taxes frozen is talk to your city council into lowering the police budget by $10. So I don't think it works as a policy matter, but he's serious, and as is the lieutenant governor and speaker, about reining in cities that are trying to defund or reorganize police departments.
And then, Bud, the big question is, does this appeal to suburban voters?
Well, I think that, first of all, it would backfire on the governor because the cities would immediately freeze police budgets if they could never raise them. They would never raise them if they couldn't cut them again. So they'd freeze them. This was a political threefer for the governor, though. He got to talk about freezing property taxes. He got to talk about supporting law enforcement, and he got to bash Austin. So it was an all-around win for the governor, coming up on election.
Bernadine, Republicans are making this an issue in November. Is this going to hurt Democrats?
You know what? This is a win for Republicans at this time. Because in January, number one, they have to ensure that they do have the majority. But you're going to be running into, when you freeze property taxes, you're also talking about budgets for education. You're talking about other budgets.
Yeah.
And in January or next year, you're going to have problems with school districts getting funding. So it is a political win at this time.
All right, Bernadine, that's our time. Guys, we appreciate it. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next Sunday on another episode of Inside Texas Politics. Hope you have a good week.